CBS News polling shows both vice presidential candidates got a boost in favorability among those who watched last night's debate. And we're hearing from both the Harris and Trump campaigns who are weighing in on how their respective running mates perform. So let's bring in CBS News campaign reporters Aaron Navarro and Zach Hudak for more on the reaction to the debate from those at the top of the ticket. So, Aaron, let me begin with you. How's the Harris campaign feeling about Governor Walz's performance last night?
Glad, good to be with you. Unsurprisingly, they felt that he did a good job in terms of highlighting the contrast on key Democratic issues, women's reproductive rights, and the threats to democracy angle that they have been painting Trump and Vance with, especially that answer at the end where Walz asked Vance if he believed Trump lost the 2020 election. Vance didn't give a clear yes or no. The Harris campaign has already cut that into an ad. But from talking to Democratic operatives, not affiliated with the campaign, but were watching last night, they did believe Walz had a shaky start in that first answer about foreign policy, but felt that he got more comfortable as the debate kept going. But in the grand scheme of things, they're not predicting it to cause any big shifts in the electorate.
Let me ask you quickly, Aaron, about what Governor Walz said about Tiananmen Square and being in Beijing in 1989. How do you address that? And could that be a problem for him? Because it was surprising to me that, I don't know, the way he responded to it was almost as if he hadn't prepared to respond to it, and he probably should have been.
But he seemed a little bit caught off guard with that answer, saying that he was a knucklehead and he misspoke. He had similar answers when questions about his military record when he first jumped into this race were coming up. That was something people watching the debate last night, operatives said they were surprised he wasn't a bit more prepped for that answer. They argued, Democratic operatives I talked to, that it won't matter much in the grand scheme of things, but we are expecting Walz to do more travel and do more interviews, the campaign says, in the next couple of weeks, where he will likely be asked again about that Tiananmen Square incident.
Yeah, and I know from people who are Democrats and activists that in their minds, folks who are supporting the Harris-Walz ticket, that, look, when they compare to Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, they say those are minor quibbles in somebody's track record. So let's talk about the Trump campaign, Zach. How is the former president responding to J.D. Vance's performance in the debate last night? I only ask because, or I only chuckle because, as we all know, Trump loves live tweeting events and loves live tweeting campaign events, including debates, and he was doing that last night on Truth Social.
Vlad, that's exactly right. And we saw repeatedly the former president take aim at Governor Walz 4 times that he misspoke and things like that. The Trump campaign is acting like they are very happy with Senator Vance's performance last night. We expected him to be very aggressive, and at times he was. But I think what was notable was that there were actually a few wholesome moments between them. For instance, when he apologized to Governor Walz and said, "I'm sorry that your son had to go through witnessing a shooting recently. I didn't know that." And those are a few moments that, if you compare the way that J.D. Vance was debating when he was running for the Senate, he had a much more aggressive, sometimes a little bit bully-like debate persona. He's very skilled as a debater, but he did not have wholesome moments like that. So that was something that was surprising and that I think we're going to see resonate among those swing voters in battleground states who really want to see us get back to civility in politics. So that moment and others really stood out to me.
Yeah, I wonder how the former president will take to that, because as we know, he hates apologizing. He hates ever appearing in what would, in his mind, be a moment of weakness by just being a gentleman in an environment like the one we witnessed yesterday. You even saw that moment towards the end, guys, where their respective wives came up on stage. They chatted on the stage, all 4 of them. They came over to Nora and to Margaret to shake their hands. It was something we hadn't seen probably in like 8 years. So I thought that was kind of cool. But let me ask you one last question, Zach, about the interview that former President Trump was set to conduct with 60 Minutes. He's now canceled that. We know that he keeps saying he's not going to debate Vice President Harris again. So she's going to carry on with that 60 Minutes interview. And again, the question becomes, for the Trump camp, do they really want the last debate to be the last word? In other words, by all accounts, getting trounced by the vice president. And also now she gets a national platform to talk about her policies just a few weeks before the election.
Vlad, I think the way they see it is that he has a tremendous social media following and he's able to speak directly to his base when he wants to. So I think in a lot of ways, they're not that concerned about it. They know that he's going to hold these large rallies, that they're going to be available to watch online, and that the people who want to hear him speak have an opportunity to if they want to.
All right, Aaron and Zach, thank you guys. Appreciate it.